Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universal Church of Houston for our weekly online Ministers Forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, and others about how we can collectively address the present crisis. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us online science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get through these difficult times. Today I'm joined by Aisha Hauser, the President-elect of the Liberal Religious Educators Association. Aisha is an accomplished religious educator, curriculum developer, author, and anti-racism advocate. She recently earned her master's level credentials with the Unitarian Universalist Association's Religious Education Credentialing Program. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. We hope you find these forums a source of connection, hope, and clarity. Aisha, thank you for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. And I wonder if you could begin just by talking with us a bit about what faith development is.
So put simply, faith development is humans trying to make sense of the universe. And throughout our lifetimes, that is different depending on whether we're toddlers or grown adults. And faith development happens throughout our lifetime, whether or not it's not about attachment to believing in a deity. It is rather how we make sense of the world and how we experience that which is not tangible. So that's the short answer.
Okay, so it's basically how we understand how our religious approach to reality, you might say, or our approach to the world around us through religion?
Yeah, exactly. How we understand, how we relate to, and how we interact with. I wouldn't even say necessarily religion, because I think there's an element of faith development, even if people aren't necessarily attending a religious community. So the popularity of yoga or popularity of self-help and movements that many were started by Oprah Winfrey are all, to me, aspects of faith development and people trying to understand their relationship to each other and the world in a way that isn't a tangible, concrete about eating or, it's not about eating, drinking, or breathing. It's something else that we need. We're wired to try to figure out why we're here and make sense of ourselves and the universe. So yes, religion, and also I don't think it necessarily is that concrete that it's attached to a religion, if that makes sense.
So it's something that everybody does, regardless of whether they're part of
100%.
Okay.
Yes.
So how do Unitarian Universalists generally approach it?
So Unitarian Universalism is, I like to quote my colleague Jessica York, who's also a religious educator, and I heard her say many, many years ago, Unitarian Universalism does not teach us what to believe, rather how to believe. So our approach to faith development is, and our exploration, there are a lot of religious education programs that are called religious exploration, is to make meaning through questioning and through trying to understand how the world is, and that we have agency. So even starting in preschool, our preschool programs, we have the preschoolers form a covenant. So a way to, hey, what do we agree to when we're together? How do we agree that we are going to be in this space? And so for preschoolers, it'll be something like don't kick or don't hit or use your words. And they get progressively more sophisticated as they get older. And that's a part of meaning making. It's a part of how are we when we are in community together. And for religious education and faith development of any age, these agreements are one way that we are explicit in how to make sense of the world. And then different aspects of that are how do we exist in a pluralist faith, because we are a faith without a creed. So we don't mandate a belief of a God or any kind of strict adherence to one kind of system. And so rather it's, what lesson can we learn from the Buddhist faith or the Christian faith or the Jewish faith? And how does that apply to how we live our lives with a commitment? To me, one of the things that's clear is if we affirm the inherent one of our statements is affirming the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Well, then how does that play out in the world, and what is our mandate to make the world more just and equitable? And so it's all connected and kind of going myriad ways, but in all different directions in terms of faith development. So it's how we see the world, not what we believe. It's more how we exist and how to question, and understanding that we have agency.
I think the thing that I find really interesting, or one thing I find very interesting about that, is you can really sort of see Unitarianism's relationships to sort of other philosophical traditions, right? So you probably know that Sophia Fives was like this sort of great religious educator of the early 20th century to the mid 20th century within the Unitarian Universalist tradition. And she was a student of John Dewey, who was a philosopher of democracy and education, and really he advocated kind of that the idea of education was not to make people learn rote information, like your historical facts or your grammatical facts or whatever, but rather to learn how to learn.
Right.
And I think about his relationship to Sophia Fives, who then I think took those ideas and applied them to her understanding of, at the time, Unitarianism. And so it's just interesting to me to hear sort of like you as the president-elect of Loretta sort of continuing to articulate that perspective in an updated, 21st century form.
Here's what I need to say something about Sophia Fives, because I have several patron saints. She's one of them. She wrote a book in the 50s called Jesus the Carpenter's Son. That's pretty radical for, an age of Christianity where people, for the most part, mainstream, even Protestant religions accepted that Jesus was the Son of God. And so the idea that a Unitarian Christian faith, a religious educator, prominent, wrote a book called Jesus the Carpenter's Son is extraordinary. And she's very much took the themes, and her version of Jesus, of the Easter story of the resurrection, is Jesus so made an impact on his friends and his disciples that they carried him and his stories in their hearts. And that's the rebirth. And that's for that time, especially, I think, and a female woman who wasn't necessarily, there weren't that many religious female leaders, is extraordinary. And absolutely, the Loretta carries that legacy of questioning and naming and reframing to make sense of the world in a way that makes more sense for modern times.
So we're going to get to that, I think, a little bit more in depth towards the close of the interview, because we're going to talk about kind of what you think the role of religious education in dealing with anti-racism is. But before we get there, I think I'd like to turn the conversation for a little bit to just contrasting Unitarian Universalists' approach to faith development or religious exploration to creed-based faith traditions like what you just mentioned, mainline and evangelical Protestant Christianity, and also, implicitly the Catholic tradition.
So the thing about, and I grew up Muslim, so I did grow up in one of the Abrahamic faiths, pretty strict Muslim, and my mother's still a strict Muslim. And what a strict interpretation of Islam or the Jewish faith or the Christian faith have in common is the notion that all the answers are in books that were written thousands of years ago. And so one of the things that I believe with my heart is that revelation is not sealed. That's one of the things that I've heard many, many religious educators and clergy say, is that there's, for Unitarian Universalists, a dictate or a mandate of how we're supposed to live didn't end with books written ancient texts. I mean, there are themes, because how humanity has behaved over millennia in some ways hasn't changed, and in many ways has. And so the difference is Unitarian Universalism does not say, here are the books that were written and you have to adhere to them, or you have to think in this way, or you have to think of women this way, or gender, or the LGBT community. So there's the expectation in Unitarian Universalism that we are going to examine what we think we know. And so that is a reading, and I'm trying to think of now who wrote it, and it's not coming to me, but that to me is our blessing is our curse. It's a blessing that we examine and re-examine what we think we know, and at the same time sometimes it takes us away from our core values of caring for each other and reaffirming our interconnection. And so having grown up with, every time I asked a question about why things happen or why things didn't happen or why women had to cover or why, and my answer to any question starting with why was because God said so, because it's in the Quran, because the prophet said so. And for evangelical Christianity, they start saying the Bible and reading passages from the Bible, and it's the same answer, which is very static. And to me, that's how I left the faith. It just ceased to make sense to me as I was getting older.
So, I mean, one of the things that's interesting, I feel like this need to go back to pragmatism because Dewey is a pragmatist philosopher, one of the big ones, and then Sophia Fives comes out of that tradition. And hearing you speak, it's very interesting just, to reflect on within the pragmatist tradition. There's this idea that we will never actually know the truth. We just keep trying to maybe get a little bit closer to the truth because nobody can actually have all the information necessary to know the truth. And it's always sort of iterative and conditional, right? Like you might know so much about the condition of the world at this point, but then the world changes and your position in the world changes, so you still know only so much about the world, which seems very different than the approach that you're sort of lifting up as the kind of more creed-based approach, where here is the truth. It is inscribed upon our hearts for all times, and in these books for all times, and really the only project is to follow this truth that was given on high. And I think that that actually somewhat leads to my next question, which is, so we're in the midst of this strange time, certainly not unprecedented time, because there have been plagues and pandemics before, and religious communities have had to figure out how to respond to them before. But what's unprecedented about it, from my perspective, is the availability of sort of of technology to lots of people, right? So to almost any. Any small congregation, if their minister has a smartphone, which they do, their clergy leaders or just their leaders have a smart, phone, they can set up some kind of continuingly online engagement for people who want to join the community or participate in the community, which is very different than, say, what things looked like in 1918 when you had the Spanish flu pandemic and many, many congregations close their doors to physical services. So I'm wondering if, we've talked about how Unitarian Universalism has this iterative approach of trying to sort of, not say the truth is fixed for all times, and that faith development is something that kind of evolves or shifts over a person's lifetime, and that our approaches to it evolve and shift. So I'm wondering right now, in the midst of the great pandemic of 2020, what you would say approaches to faith development are changing, or how they're changing in light of the current crisis?
So here's the thing. I think the internet is a blessing and a curse. I think we have good cases to make for both of those points of view. And the blessing of having technology and social media and the internet is that people, faith development, religious educators, clergy, religious professionals immediately went online and said, what do we do now and how do we do this? And there were some congregations that were already streaming services, and the vast majority weren't. And I'm talking now only the Unitarian Universalist context, of which I'm most familiar. And so immediately what we did was, those of us who maybe hadn't had a strong online presence turned to those who did and said, hey, how do we do this? What do we do? Where do we start? And so the already collaborative network of religious educators became more so. And then we were we being religious educators are very open source. So it's like, hey, I need this help. Here's 8 different ways to do this thing that I need help with. And so the collaborative piece of how we are became just kicked up 100-fold. So then turning to, as soon as we closed congregations aren't closed, the buildings are closed, is we immediately said to folks, here, we didn't even miss 1 week. East Shore Unitarian Church in Bellevue is where I'm currently the religious educator, director of lifelong learning. And before we went fully online, we had one more service. We're in Washington State, and so we were one of the first states to have all of this coming down the pike. And so we had one service where we usually have maybe about 150, 170. We had 20 people. We didn't have coffee hour, and we realized we need to close our physical doors. Immediately the next week, we hopped on Zoom. We had more people. We've been having consistently more people attend on Zoom than we had in our physical space. And that is information for us that many, many people are wanting to stay connected. And we're finding families are sitting around the computer and being in service together in a way they never were in our brick and mortar spaces. And so we're creating, this is contextual because every congregation is different, as we always are with Unitarian Universalists. And we're finding what is the same is people want opportunities to hear stories, to live our faith continually at home and not disrupt that. And so that's something that I think is the opportunity here for Unitarian Universalism, is to have folks embody their faith in home, especially with families, in a way they hadn't before. So I kind of name that Unitarian Universalism in many ways is a transactional faith. And we have a program called Our Whole Lives, which is a sexuality education program we developed with United Church of Christ, immensely popular. And without fail, I've been doing this 17 years. Whenever I've offered OWL, we have people who are not Unitarian Universalists. They hear about it through other parents, come to the church for however long we're offering the program, and never come back to Unitarian Universalism. They simply come for OWL. And then we have folks who are maybe in interfaith families and show up to church and then have their children have some form of religious education and then leave. And I don't know if they light a chalice every day at home or once a week even. But now that we're at home, I work with an RE programs coordinator. She created a whole website just of resources for families that include, here's how to make a chalice. It's actually very easy. You can make it with a cup and a saucer, and you could use a small candle. And so now is the opportunity for folks of all ages and families to light a chalice at home, to have a reading. There's so many resources online for how to live our faith at home, which is something I grew up with as a Muslim in a Muslim family. This faith was never separate. We actually rarely went to the mosque. Our faith and how we embodied our faith was not connected to any physical space. It is just who we were. And so to me, the opportunity for families and faith development is that starts happening with Unitarian Universalists, is that we're living our faith 24/7 rather than going to this place and receiving some kind of product, however, intangible it is, and then leaving. Rather, it's like, what are we called to do and how are we called to be every day of the week?
Yeah, no, it's a great answer. I guess one thing I'm wondering, so, we're online now, and we've seen sort of a similar pattern. We have about 900 households who participate in our online programming once a month, which is significantly more than our 350 households that are members of the congregation, right? So we've seen that sort of expansion very much that you're talking about. But what we've also seen, and I'm curious if this is true for you, or what you've seen at East Shore, is we've seen an increase in sort of adult engagement and engagement amongst teens, and just really, really big struggles for parents with middle school and families with kids that are younger than that to figure out ways to engage online. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, if that matches your experience or not.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, 100%. And what we're finding is older folks, older being retired, and we have in our congregation 30 members over the age of 90. And so we skew older. We're about the same size as Houston, maybe about 435. I think you all might be a little bigger. And so we have folks in our 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. They're loving being online. They're saying, even if they live at home, they're saying, you know what, we love these Zoom meetings. We have check-ins every single morning. and they're loving that experience. Now, the teenagers, our youth, have been, they were devastated because their spring conference was canceled because of COVID-19. And so, but they did a bridging online. They've really gone out of our youth group is meeting online. So yes, we're having that experience. Definitely my heart goes out to parents of young children who are expected to homeschool. I just think, or online school. And I think that expectation is, it's unreasonable, frankly. And I don't think it's serving either the families or the children or even the school and what the desired outcome is. Having said that, we're finding the same thing. Like we are offering family connections and meetings, and we're not having huge as strong a response as with the other groups. And it is because folks are tired of screen time, which is completely understandable, and overwhelmed because the expectation is, especially for working parents, they're still working and expected to take care of children and expecting to school them. And it's, if I can digress for a second, it's our hyper violent extractive capitalist society that's still expecting production, even in the midst of a pandemic. And it's just, heartbreaking, and it's, I've kind of racked my brain, like, how do we most support parents? And in some ways I said, who I collaborate with, Amanda, I said to her, we need to give everybody a break. Like, we can offer these, say, here they are, and just no expectations. We do not want this to be one more thing that you are feeling like you're not doing, so it's kind of having a lot of grace and having online worship, because those same families who aren't having the capacity to show up during the week it's so sweet to see, because of Zoom, which we are still doing Zoom. We're not doing the same really professional setup that Houston's doing. We see families around the same computer, and so the children are, looking in the camera and waving and saying hi, and so they're showing up. They're just not showing up during the week or for extra things.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is maybe we're finding is that our parents group is actually going pretty strong. So people are finding that to be supportive. But that the programming expectations for kids to tune into it becomes yet another form of sort of online school, which I think is a very challenging thing for parents right now is online schooling. I mean, I certainly have had my challenges around that with my son that I think we've worked through, but nonetheless was a big challenging adjustment. And so not having it be something that's helpful, an opportunity for parents to connect with each other around what they're struggling with, rather than unhelpful. One more thing that parents who are now occupying the role of, worker, if they're still lucky enough to be employed, teacher and parent, and often in times sole companion to their child, or sole physical companion to their child or children, is a lot.
We have a family covenant circle that was meeting the past many, many years. When I came to East Shore years ago, it was already going once a month. They now have been meeting once a week, and they absolutely have been right after service on Sundays. So they come to service and then meet for another couple of hours, and they've been very well attended and successful. Absolutely, that's true. And I forgot about that. On Sundays, the Family Covenant Circle, they said, can we meet once a week? And we're like, absolutely, whatever you need, we will provide. And that's not something the religious, that is something we support, and we offer whatever they need, but I don't attend that and I don't manage it. It's facilitated completely by parents. And that has been very, very, people have been super appreciative that they are now meeting once a week instead of once a month. Absolutely.
So before we close, I'd like to turn the conversation to anti-racism. You've been a fierce advocate for racial justice, and you helped launch something called the White Supremacy Teach-In. What was the White Supremacy Teach-In, and why was it important?
So the White Supremacy Teach-In was a deeply collaborative effort of myself and two religious educator colleagues, Kenny Wiley and Christina Rivera, along with about 25 to 30 religious educators who came together to start talking about the ways that white supremacy culture have been a part of Unitarian Universalism, and before 61, a part of Unitarianism and Universalism. And if we are committed And I had a colleague tell me that she's not convinced all UUs are committed to dismantling systems of oppression. So that's a fair statement. I am working on the mandate, the way I live out Unitarian Universalism, that we are committed to dismantling systems of oppression. How is this playing out? And so the teach-in happened when there was the realization that what we were saying and doing, including having seminarians and ministers and religious professionals of color meet once a year, underwritten by the UUA, funded by the UUA, to this retreat to help support religious professionals of color, with the hope that this translates into leaders of color being in congregations, and then more people of color wanting to be part of the UU faith. And that what we were saying and what was happening weren't meshing, and then it culminated in, for me, when I went to the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism convening, and Black Lives of UU started in 2015, just 5 years ago, and a group of folks who said we need a space that is explicitly for Black Unitarian Universalists or Black people who are adjacent to Unitarian Universalism. And having gone to that convening, I glimpsed an experience. I've had an experience of Unitarian Universalism that wasn't white-centered, and expanded my imagination, and it expanded my it kind of lit a fire in me, saying we need to do more, and we need to do something different, and we need to expand our imaginations. And so there's a website, uuteachin.org, that has resources for congregations to learn about how we are all a part of white supremacy culture, a culture that privileges and benefits people of dominant culture of European descent in ways that simply no other group is privileged. And Unitarian Universalism is simply a part of that. And when we started saying this is, Unitarian Universalism is a part of white supremacy culture, there was a huge, I'm going to say white lash. There were folks that were just so angry. And then it was actually Kenny Wiley who said, we need to do a teach-in. There needs to be education around why we're using this terminology and why this is important for Unitarian Universalism to address. And so there's a much more nuanced stuff to this. This is a short answer, and maybe not so short answer. And I would definitely suggest going to the Teach-In website. And there's still a lot of resources that I still even look up. There are worship resources, there's songs, there's lifting up of Black Unitarian Universalists and our trans siblings, and many other resources that lift up folks that aren't that aren't of European descent exclusively, in order to really help our faith live out who we say we want to be in the world. And we're not going to do that by accident. It's not going to happen organically. I watched some of your sermon last week, Colin, and yes, the arc of the universe is long, and it always bends towards justice, but it needs help. Was it Barack Obama who said that? Like, the arc isn't going to bend, it's not neutral. Like, right. We need to bend it, and we need to bend it towards justice. It's not going to happen by accident. It's not going to happen, frankly, by praying for it. We need to make it happen.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's a very humanistic approach, a very Unitarian Universalist approach, is that our actions matter, and our actions, theists would say are about cooperating with the divine, and humanists would simply say, no, that's pretty much all there is, and we're not going to get into that debate right now, but I think that the core message is really that it matters what we do. And that actually, yep. Like looping back to the beginning of the conversation, I think that one of the things that I really learned as a kid growing up a Unitarian Universalist is that it matters more what we do than what we believe. And that's a very key teaching for Unitarian Universalism. I want to hone in on something you said for a moment, and then move on towards a question I have about kind of the changing role of religious professionals during this time. So you use the word white supremacy culture, and I think that in my understanding, that's kind of like the key frame and the thing that like people often miss and generates this, what you were calling white lash, right? Which is that it's about culture and the structure of institutions and like the way society is set up, much more so than it is like about individual people's intentions. So like, you know, somebody can be not necessarily have, you know, any sort of racist intentions or thoughts in their heart, but can still be participating in white supremacy culture because that's the way the whole economy is structured, is that it's predicated on, you know, brown and black bodies are used to produce white wealth, and to preserve white, you know, preserve and privilege white power. And we see that, I mean, like, certainly right now. Rather than like, you know, you're a racist because you're part of a white supremacy culture. I mean, certainly people can be racist and be part of that, and there's definitely a very large segment of people who are. But, you know, we live in a country that was founded by slaveholders, primarily, many historians would argue, so that those slaveholders could continue to engage in the projects of expropriating the lands of indigenous peoples and enslaving people of African descent. So, you know, that's where this country comes from, and we have to reckon with that. I feel like that was sort of like the big move that a lot of people well, a lot of white people miss. Well, not just white people, but a lot of people miss, and then have this sort of what you're calling white lash against it. I don't know if you have reflections on that, but I did want to kind of lift up that term.
I saw the Christian writer who's a minister also, Jim Wallace, talk about his book, America's Original Sin. And one of the first things he said was, America's original sin was not slavery, it's white supremacy. And he said it is why, you know, indigenous people there were genocide against Native Americans, and it allowed people to enslave Africans, white people, because of this notion that God loves white people more than others, right? And so it is embedded in the United States, in the founding. It is embedded in Unitarian Universalism. It can't not be. And this is not, I think what I have been intrigued, I guess is the word, especially, I will say, I understand lay leaders or lay folk having a reaction to this. I am disappointed, I'm going to use the word disappointed, in clergy and learned ministers, UU ministers, who are clearly just, we can't use this word, you're calling me racist. And to not, and I know y'all, what you do for seminary and through this ministerial formation process, do a lot of questioning and learning. And I'm like, so let's stop for a second and think about the structures that created the foundation of both Unitarian Universalism and the United States. They are inextricably connected. And so when we're talking about, there is so much evidence. It's kind of like what I say to folks now, I'm not going to argue that the world is flat. There is no argument to be had. The world is round, right? So when you look at now the protests of the white people in the face of cops, of police, no one is getting shot on sight. No one is getting arrested. So, I mean, that is the most explicit example of white privilege and the fact that we live in a white supremacy culture. The fact that Black and brown Unitarian Universalists, Indigenous Unitarian Universalists, and Black Unitarian Universalists and people of color have to continually explain their experience and be told intention matters more than impact, and be told we didn't mean that way. There is, even the argument itself is harmful and destructive and centers white feelings. Like that's the part that I think has been disappointing, because I feel that I have a higher bar for UUs, which I shouldn't. We're all people. So there's no reason why I should have a higher bar for one group of people than another. But I feel like the faith that mandates for us that we think for ourselves and that we have agency, that we use that to say who benefits the most from this setup, from this society. And it's clear, the answers are there and it's clear. And to me, what value is there in arguing someone else's experience or arguing the facts and how this society is set up? I honestly haven't. I know that white people need, especially the folks who have this visceral reaction to the words white supremacy culture, need pastoral care around it. It's like, yep, the world maybe is not the way you envisioned it was, and I think that was made clear after the 2016 election and white liberals' response to it, where Black and brown folks were like, yeah, this is the country that has existed, but you all thought it was something else. And so, but I've genuinely tried to be as compassionate as I possibly can, because I'm frankly frustrated by the whole notion that there's this debate. Again, no one would debate that the earth is flat. No one engages in that debate. No one that I know who has, graduated, 10th grade or even 6th grade would argue that the world is flat. But yet we're having this argument that our society privileges one group of people over another. And even if you don't want to use the words white supremacy culture, we can use the words learned preference for white leadership, learned preference for white beauty. It's a learned preference, and it means supremacy, right?
Yeah, we are pretty much out of time. So I do think, I do want to thank you. I was going to ask you a bit about the role of religious professionals in kind of the struggle for justice, but I think and dismantling white supremacy, but I think that we kind of need to wrap up today. So I want to thank you very much for your time. And I mean, of course, I could say like a lot of things in response to what you've said. This has been a very interesting conversation. You brought out a lot of great points on both faith development and racial justice and sort of the challenge of dismantling white supremacy and kind of why you think that that's important and why it is important. But unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. So thank you, Aisha, for joining us. And thank you to all of our members and viewers for tuning in. And I hope that those of you watching will join us next week when I'll be speaking with our music director, Mark Vogel, about the role of music in online congregational worship. The forum is going to include a musical experience and reflections on how we have tried to keep community going through music during this time of crisis. If you found this video to be helpful, please consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Our assistant minister, the Reverend D. Scott Cooper, will be preaching this week on Perseverance and Mother's Day. The service will include readings, prayers, and music by our award-winning music director, Mark Vogel. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was filmed and produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. See you all online soon and in person as soon as possible for us to gather again. And please, remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we are all in this together.